My name is Ruth Adams, and I am one of the co-executive directors of Art OMI. We're honored to be co-hosting tonight with the family. For those of you who don't know what Art OMI is, it's an art center upstate, and it's a residency program, and it's an exhibition space and an education program. The artist residency was the first program that started in 1992, and Robert Morgan was our critic, our first critic in residence. So he has a very special meaning to us. Art OMI residency programs, I assume a lot of you know about that, are really about community. And so a long history of community and what we really call Art OMI family has evolved since 1992. And I just wanted to say there are some people who are not with us anymore who are also part of that family, and I just want to read a few of their names who were also close with Robert, who we also miss. John Cross, Alan Kirli, Tadaki Kuyama, Judy Willows, Holly Block, Fred Holland, Elizabeth Ackerman, Henry, Francis, and Carl Schools. Those are just some people, but I wanted to mention them knowing that some of their friends and family are here. I'll just quickly say, in Robert, we're celebrating, as we all know, a very large intellect and a curious intellect. But what I think about every time I think of Robert is his greeting. Every time Robert saw you, he, big smile, eyes wide open, shoulders back, and just the warmest hello every time, full of energy. And I can't get that out of my head. Big warm hello. So welcome. And I want to introduce the trio, Soto Steele with the trio Rudia. Thank you so much. And now a visual tribute to Robert.
I had gotten back from my second trip to Europe in 1971. By 1972, I began to think about showing my work, because I was very encouraged by what I was doing over in Denmark, in the little town of Växjö, where I had a studio. I thought, maybe I should get an MFA, Master of Fine Arts degree. I decided that I wanted to teach art history, and I wanted to be an artist. I didn't want to be an artist and teach being an artist. I wanted to separate my profession as an artist from my profession as an art historian. So I applied to a program at New York University, received my PhD. That entitled me to teach art history. My first job was not art history per se, it was art education at Wichita State University. What went along with that is my invitation to curate at the Ulrich Museum, which was on the campus. For the 3 years that I was there, I did 3 different exhibitions. The first was an Alan Capro retrospective, which included one of his so-called happenings or activities. The second one was survey of artist books. I began with Duchamp's Green Box Notes, which I got a copy of, along with many of the conceptual artists in New York, like Lawrence Weiner, Joseph Kossuth, and Robert Barry, Douglas Hubler, among others. The third exhibition was based on the work of Komar and Melamid, who were 2 Russian artists. They were taking conceptual art in a new direction. The direction wasn't simply narrative, but it opened up a kind of political discourse, which in those days was not so common. On the basis of that, I was hired as an art historian at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which is in upstate New York, near Buffalo. I was doing courses like contemporary art. This is the first time the institution had come into my career, teaching that you need to do research on a regular basis. And the research is not always what you're going to be talking about in class, but maybe sidelights of information from other periods that are comparable to the period that you're going to be talking about. I think that that is very important. How to bring the past into the present, how to make the present the past, in a sense, so that the past is not simply buried, but it is alive and fresh and open to new interpretation. I had had a very important meeting with the abstract expressionist artist Robert Motherwell. He said to me, in the way of advice, because at that time I was very young, he said, listen, if you're going to be an artist, don't teach art, teach something else. Well, the something else for me was art history, because I think there's a big breach between being a studio artist, teaching, and being an art historian. And I like that. I like that kind of separation. I like the fact that I was doing research, that I was attending to my way of speaking in relation to students and conducting a kind of discourse in the classroom. I enjoyed that very much. The fact that I was involved with art history eventually led me to criticism, and I began writing criticism in late 1979. The other part is that I was writing for Arts Magazine, as well as other foreign publications like Art Press in Paris, where I wrote for, I think, 2 decades, from 1992 to 2001, I believe it was, something like that. As for writing criticism, it really was a great exercise in the use of language, in how to investigate, once again, the various works in various media, to understand the direction of the artist, to talk with the artist, to get some sense of who they were and why they were doing what they were doing, and then to maybe give I don't want to call it a judgment, but a point of view in terms of why this work may be significant or where it may be lacking in terms of what it's trying to achieve. I'm interested in making a painting that communicates, but it communicates something that I have in mind and body and maybe soul. Now, my paintings deal with geometry, but in a very particular sense. I am much more engaged in what I would call the haptic or the tactile relationship to my work, even though I have to say that the tactility is very reduced in terms of how it sits in relation to the picture plane. I'm not trying to blare it out as something that is necessary for me to communicate. My communication is basically how I work and what I work on and how I see it at the moment that I know the work has been achieved in terms of that particular piece. My communication is independent in terms of whatever I feel it might be on that occasion in relation to a specific work. My concern is the work itself and how accurate the work is in terms of its completion and how it relates systemically to the body of work that I'm continuing to put forth. People used to ask me, how can you do all this? How can you do all these? Well, you decide that you're going to do them, first of all, and you make time in your schedule for when you're going to do them, and you try and be as clear as possible in terms of what you're attempting to achieve. Art has many facets, and you can be good at all of them if you work at it. It requires a good sense of dedication, that you are going to really work to do your best work. That's what I believed was necessary in order to work in this multiple area. When you get excited about something, you want to investigate the ideas, the materials, if the materials are involved, the sense of the object, if the object is involved. You want to be clear on how all of these things are working in relation to one another.
And now we'll have a tribute from the family. Is that correct? Soojung and Charles?
Thank you so much. Robert, he could be so happy. Yesterday, I went to a cafe near my neighbors. A young lady who might know Robert and me, and asked me why I recently came by myself without my husband. So I briefly answered that. He's not here, but he's here. After her unexpected question, I couldn't avoid crying for a while. But tonight, so many people who remember Robert and then celebrate his life. I'm so appreciate all your supporting and love to him. Just to you watch the video, the original recording from 2021. During the pandemic time, we stayed at the country house, and then we prayed several things. I tried to record about his life and art. So that is coming tonight. Last year, July 10, he was hospitalized. That is his 81st birthday. And then he spent time almost 106 days moving between the hospital and the rehabilitation centers, facing his challenges of illness until his passing October 23. Even during the difficult times, he and I enjoyed life together. Went to visit museums and then attending gallery openings and dining out, eat food. So remarkably, I realized that today is another 106 days he has passed. We often think of time as a linear, past, present, and future. However, all is progression. It's like intertwined with me now. It's like video. Being with Robert on his last passage made me think deeply about the true meaning of life and death. Neither of us expect the end to be so near. He never talked about what he wanted after his death. He wished to keep living longer. As an artist and writer, his physical death is just one chapter of his whole life. His art, his writing, his creative spirit remain with us, and they will live on. Robert's passion for life and his wish to live fully can be honored to be sustained through our love and support. So those who create and love, death is never the final word. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I've been acquainted with many of you, but a lot of you haven't. Most likely it was in a Chelsea gallery, and my dad said, like, oh, yeah, here's my son. He's from MIT. Doesn't know anything about art, but they tell me he's smart. I remember that line a couple of times. And he always had that. Most of you guys know him as a tall, charming, handsome, with a curious wit and a endless humor, You know what it's like for a son? Grow up with such a cool dad. It's like a cool dad syndrome thing. You spend your whole life getting out from underneath the shadows of your dad. But then I ended up taller. And more charming, but slightly less good looking. I opened the door for him one time and I said, "Age before beauty, sir." And he pushed me in front. He said, "You'd still lose." But that's just the kind of fun stuff we would do. I met my father when I was 20, right at that delicate age when a boy realizes the urgent procrastination about figuring out what kind of man he's supposed to be. And my mom really pushed me into math and science. I was an electrical engineer at MIT, like every Chinese mother's dream. But he started showing me poetry, and he started showing me some of his books, and started showing me art and helping me think about it. And it was always, I realized in this time of my life, I was always thinking about how do we build this? How do we build that? How does this work? How does that work? And then he was the one that pushed me to ask why. Why should we build this? Why should a human work? Why should some other human to do the work that you don't want to do? Why should you build a machine to do the work that you can't convince another human to do? Why should you give that machine intelligence so that they can build more machines to do all this work that humans, who decided that we needed to do all this work? What should you build, son? And these are the questions that he would ask me while we were having pancakes in the morning. Light and fluffy. Until eventually I got to the point where I understood what he was talking about. And I understood why he spent his life building artists. because he believed that this was the thing that the world needed in order to keep being an enjoyable place for humans. Right? They talk about philanthropy, this word, philos anthropos, the love of humanity. If you look at humanity, it looks like we love machines more than we love humanity. And this was a thing that I think he saw in my path, that he helped course correct, in the sense that, you know, this question of why do we build is so much more important than how do we build it. And that if you lose this kind of connection to the human condition, this tactility of the human experience, he used to call it, then you really do believe that a digital life is better than a life filled with love and human connection. And, you know, while all those other sons with their cool dads try to get out from underneath the shadow, I kind of find myself getting into his shadow. I recently joined the family business. I published my first book. I picked up my violin. I started making music. And, you know, this is what he did in the world. This was his legacy. This was with the students at the School of Visual Arts and the other institutions, with his family, with the criticism in the professional domain and in the personal domain, as he was trying to make more artists out of us. And I think that's a beautiful way to have spent one's life. So thank you all for coming to be here to celebrate his journey, and I look forward to speaking with you all. Thank you.
Sorry. Oh, Francis Greenberger is here, the founder of Artomai, is here to talk about Robert's contribution to the art world.
Good evening, everybody. I met Robert approximately 35 years ago in the first year of OMI's existence. He was, as Ruth mentioned, our first critic in residence. I was impressed by his physical height, his conviction, and his self-discipline with regard to all aspects of his work and ideas as an independent critic and curator, but also to his sport of choice, swimming. It was really only in the later years that I realized he was equally committed to his own creative talents as an artist. I'm happy to say I have several of Robert's paintings in my collection. Robert's impact on me and all who knew him cannot be overestimated. His conviction about his own points of view were not only persuasive, but they were empowering. If Robert could be so convinced, why couldn't we? And his convictions, like my own, were not such as to eliminate the possibility of other, even contrary ideas. In fact, he liked being challenged and being given a chance to defend his ideas. But it signaled a level of commitment that he would stand behind his conclusions and they would not easily change. Robert's connection with the international collective of artists and art fraternities is especially notable. Robert was ever willing to see and meet new artists from any corner of the world. His repeat travels to Asia, Iran, South America, Europe, and virtually the entire globe were legendary. I was as likely to meet Robert in Poland as I might be to run into him around the corner from where we both lived, a couple of blocks from each other, here in New York City. And Robert's leadership in the International Collective of Artists was particularly important during moments of self-doubt and question. At the time when the art world felt like a place where only a few stars were significant, Robert's commitment to the greater meaning of art beyond commercial success was an important theme for those who were not among the lucky few. Robert was a cherished visitor to OMI's Visual Arts Residency Program almost every year of its existence. The number of artists who held his studio visits in high regard is too many to count. Klaus Brunsman, an OMI alum, remembers Robert, quote, as a pillar of the OMI empire. In his own way, quote, a founding father, close quote. His presence was meaningful, moving, and never forgotten. I can imagine that his impact on his students at Pratt and as a teacher generally were not any less profound. He leaves many who have had committed and deep relationships with him, from his wife Soojung to his children to his many friends, all a testament to a life lived with purpose, connection, and meaning. Whether you agreed with one or another of Robert's convictions didn't matter. What mattered was that Robert mattered, and we all knew it. I shall carry my memory of him with me for the rest of my days. Thank you.
Huang is if you don't know, the publisher and contributing writer to the Brooklyn Rail, and had something to say about Robert as a writer. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. When I think about Robert, I think of two things, just hearing Charles and Soojung, and then, of course, Francis spoke. I remember once at a crowded opening of a group show at Sideshow Gallery in Williamsburg, and Robert was arguing with a young, upcoming, rather arrogant conceptual artist, whose name I would not mention. And at some point, it got really heated. I felt the need to make civic intervention. And I say, when you argue with an intelligent person, you can't win. But when you argue with a stupid person, you can't stop. I remember both of them was look at each other and look at me, rather amused, but somewhat perplexed too. And then walking away, Robert looked at me and say, I wish he read my book, The End of the Artwork. And the other thing that I don't know you noticed too, when he get irritated, even more upset, he always tried to correct anyone that he's arguing to, preferring formality, procedural over content, and substance. He would say, Robert C. Morgan, PhD. You all remember that, right? And, lately I've been thinking about the East and the West, what appeared to be above and what can be seen from below, East and West, and that duality is so intense right now. After the failure of liberal hegemony, it brought liberal democracy to its peril, or at least critical point where we are now. I'm thinking about the same thing too, in regard to how Robert in his dualistic nature. One being the fact that he were able to read the kind of repressive measure in academia, the workload and the bureaucratic work that would impede his creative commitment. He got out early. He got out early, and he knew he need to do that in order to fulfill his vision as a writer, as an artist, as a poet, as a critic, as a curator, all of it, you know? It's very intense, and I was thinking about the fact that he, through most, when you really talk to him, he's really a poet who somehow is a painter, but who thinks like an art historian in a very broad philosophical framework, and then he able to walk backward with that broad philosophical framework while he paint and writing as the means to be a poet again. And I always like that about Robert, you know. Once you know him well, you understood how his energy, as you mentioned about discipline, how that energy combined with that incredible self-discipline is so lethal in his creative energy, output, productivity. And I remember we were talking about Giordano Bruno. I mean, some of you might remember him, the great philosopher, poet, astrologist, esoteric thinker and whatnot, and who was burned at stake by the Catholic Church in sometime February 1400. He say, which I remember clearly, Robert enjoyed very much. He say, he's a painter, is the livelihood of fantasy. The poet is the enthusiasm. The philosophers are, in certain sense, painters and poets. The painters are poet and philosopher, and the poets are painter and philosopher. He is no philosopher who does not poetize and paint. Therefore, without reason, to think is to contemplate the figure of our fantasy. He is no painter who does not think and philosophize. Without thinking and painting, no one is a poet. And I think that's how he's able to inspire so many young artists and writers. I mean, I don't know how he managed to find the time to write so many thoughtful reviews, conduct brilliant interviews with so many artists, from Seo Park to Aaron Cayley Lee to Herman Nietzsche, and just to name a few. And he's able to do that, extending the time to create the most luminous contribution to other magazines too, White Hot Magazine, and I don't know, maybe 1,000 catalog essays at this point, maybe more than a dozen books, and 30 plus monographs and anthologies. It's amazing, the energy, the productivity, and the care that he really put out for our art community. And that's the key. And I know that he appreciates very much, just as someone say, don't try to spoon feed me, for the shape of the spoon is being spoon fed. And I know that Robert is a key figure in the rare community who always think out of the box, who know how to bring people to cross-pollinate, to share ideas. The end of the art world was that passionate proclamation. It's almost like a manifestation for artists. Since the 80s, values of art, prices escalated, and there's no movement, there's no community, but just perpetual so-called multinational corporation rather than a real, genuine, caring institution. We talk about Black Mountain College a great deal, and that was his philosophical framework for his thinking. And that's why he joined the rail with such commitment and passion. And I just think he's still with us. The writing is brilliant, and you will have to go back and read again. I just read his interview with Hermanich this morning, and it's just to show you that the writing is what keeps the artist alive. And that's very, very important. We tend to forget that someone like Vermeer has been forgotten more than 200 years. We tend to forget recently Philip Guston, without the writing support. I don't know how many essays and reviews that we have facilitated. I don't know however long that his daughter too have worked so hard to elevate his important. And I know the writing of Robert C. Morgan, PhD, will continue to survive and will continue to make important, relevant argument for great art and great artists. God bless your soul.
Thank you. Robert Barry, the artist, next.
So many people said so many wonderful things and quoted Robert. And I brought some things I was going to, and we saw Bob speaking. I wanted to read something that he wrote, not about me, but about art. Maybe I will. He said just about everything that I was going to say. I met him in 1976 at an exhibition I was having, and he was interested in so-called conceptual art, and he wanted to talk to me, and we had a long conversation. And over the years, I must have had dozens of talks with him again and again and again. A fascinating guy to talk to. So smart, so insightful. There's something about getting old, like me. I'm old. I'm 88. I'm going to be 89 next month. Yeah, I know. And it's about losing your friends. That emptiness that's so strong that you can't get past. I have to tell you, I was surprised when I heard that Bob passed. I mean, the last time I spoke to him, he seemed lively, and I called him. He sent me, I got this book in the mail, Chinese Ink Artists, and I called him, and I said, I was reading something. I said, a lot of them are like these scholar artists, people who make art but are also scholars, very smart. And I said, that's you, man. I know why you wrote this thing. You identify with them. That was the last time I spoke to him. I know he did a show in New York. I think probably the best thing I said to him was how much I liked the last painting show. It's just like a year ago, a couple of years ago. It was really good, very interesting. I said it reminded me of the first time back in the 60s when I first saw Lawrence Wiener's work, the artist, conceptual artist. But he was making these small paintings. And I said, yeah, they were geometric, but there was something about them that was different. There was something very individual that I haven't seen before. It isn't just some variation on some old ideas or some old strategies, but there was something different about them. And I said, that's what I thought about your last show in New York. Yeah, they were geometric and so forth, but there's something about the space that's about you that's different. Yeah, we talked about trading work, unfortunately. He left us too soon. And it didn't happen. I noticed he also did a show at Gallery Sheila in Korea was a show I did some years ago. And when they approached me about doing it, it's a wonderful gallery, by the way, Craig, one of my best, one of my favorite. I asked them if he would, they said, do you want somebody, who do you recommend to write the text for the catalog? This is the catalog. I mean, it's incredible for a show. And I asked, I gave him Bob's name, and I asked him if he would like to do it, and he said yes. And he wrote a beautiful essay here, and then he said he wanted to do an interview, which they published in here also, which I thought was wonderful and very insightful. I can't think of anybody who knew my work outside of me, who knew my work better. I miss him a lot because he was so interesting to talk to. He was up there talking, and I wanted to quote some things, but he said everything I wanted to say. But I found this old exhibition he did about 35 years ago also, called Disappearances. And it was for a little gallery, Nahon Gallery or something like that. I don't think it exists anymore. And he organized the show, and he asked me to be in it. My piece, the piece he chose from me, is called It Can Be Forgotten, from 1970. And I found something in here. I'm going to read it. I know he spoke, but I wanted to get his voice here, so I didn't know there was going to be that thing with Bob speaking. And I just wanted to quote, just very briefly, from the text he wrote 35 years ago. This exhibition proposes to raise the issue of what it means to disappear, either into or outside of a work of art. The process of art, or any description of aesthetic experience, it would seem, is about disappearance. Art becomes a perpetual realignment of perception to the horizon of thought. It is conceivable that this in itself becomes a political action, a choice of action apart from the formula that can only reap cynicism. I think that sums up a lot of what his attitude about art was. When I got this book, I called him and I said, I can see why you wrote this thing. He said, I spent a lot of time in China and spoke to the artists and so forth. The title of the book, Chinese Ink Artists, The Presence of What Is Not, was the title. Inside he wrote, to Robert Barry, friend of all friends, fond regards, Robert Morgan.
Sarah Greenberg Morse is next.
Hello. Well, I'm honored to be here. And I'm here to talk about Robert and my father, the art critic Clement Greenberg. They were men of numerous and shared facets. Poetry, painting, and art criticism were their primary passions, ones which each practiced throughout their lives, as we've heard about Robert. Though they were very different humans of different generations and backgrounds, their Venn diagrams collided with a large overlap labeled truth and beauty. They met at the end of my father's life, a time of brooding reflection. And I know this, I've been reading my father's journals, and these late pages are most of the mornings he's up late, spent the morning brooding. So that's a fact. And the universe that swirled around him was much smaller. It speaks to Robert's character, his intellect, his gentle and precise manner, and his good-natured self-confidence that the two critics spent so much meaningful time together in those years. Robert relayed to me an exchange that occurred at the end of their first meeting, just as he was leaving my father's apartment, standing in the hall waiting for the elevator. I can see my father's stooped silhouette in the doorframe as Robert turns to him and expresses his appreciation for the long visit and the agreeable conversation. All a surprise to the young man, given that Robert's reputation, to the extent that it preceded him, was built on writing about conceptual art. I can hear my father's grumbled reply, "Don't be small-minded, damn it. I would try to like conceptual art, but I can't because it's no good. But I like you plenty." Sorry. But I like you plenty, and that's what matters. As Robert often reminded me, my father believed that the way a person feels is ultimately more relevant than art. Robert's intellect came by way of a mild-mannered bearing, so different from my father, who was characterized as having a hot head and a cold heart, by W.H. Auden, no less. With the old man, Robert's warm heart and cool head prevailed. He was never one to fetishize, not a sycophant, but always a respectful fellow intellectual who knew he had much to learn, but also much ground to stand on his own. My memories of Robert are both direct and indirect by way of his relationship with my father, but a meaningful late encounter with him was at the opening of his 2022 show of new paintings, where Sublime, and these words are not my own, I'm not sure whose they are, but they were on they described the show in the press release. Sublime geometries of muted color describe the absorption and reflection of light. It was a crowded, joyous opening, but Robert made time to connect and appreciate my presence, always attentive to me as me, before we would dwell on our original connection through my father. Only in retrospect can I see that Robert struck the same balance as his paintings, reflecting and absorbing in equal measure. Robert was one of the few critics to recognize with kindness that as my father aged, his place in the history of art shifted from the center to one that was between one era and another, a shift that my father managed less than gracefully at times. Yet Robert felt no need to write off the older critic. Instead, the younger critic dug in with curiosity and appreciation as he edited the collected late writings of Clement Greenberg. Given Robert's laid-back aspect, it did not surprise me when my mother, who had left her heart in California a few years earlier, chose him for the important job of editing the collection in 2003. In his acknowledgments to that book, he wrote of my mother's intelligence, humor, and wisdom, words that perfectly describe her best qualities. She had her tough ones too, and Robert managed those with his typical grace. At the end of those acknowledgments, Robert mentions his visits with my father at my parents' apartment on Central Park West, the discussions that stretched from mid-afternoon to midnight. Maybe there was a break for Chinese takeout. The standout memory, one that Robert spoke to me about more than once, was a snowstorm that came on strong one evening while they talked and talked. My father loved winter weather, and I can imagine him sitting cozily in the snow globe of his art-lined 17th floor living room overlooking the park, enjoying Robert's company, the depth of thought taken for granted as the city was enveloped in softness and silence. I'll reach the end here with a 1971 quote from my father brought to my attention by Robert, of course, in his introduction to the late writings. Art comes out of a tradition, and a tradition is created by the interplay of expectation and satisfaction through surprise. I'd like to think that a tradition was handed off between the two critics as they continued to surprise each other. Robert hoped that my father's last writings formed a summation rather than a closure of the old man's authenticity, intelligence, and certainty. May Robert's legacy join that aggregate and be without closure. Thanks.
George Waterman, come join us.
It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about my friend Robert. Robert arrived in town in 1975. By then, the art landscape had changed rather dramatically from the time I began looking at art in the early 60s. Back then, Sidney Janis was still on East 57th Street. Arnold Glimcher at Pace was on West 57th Street. Dick Bellamy's Green Gallery was on 57th Street, and Marlowe and Emmerich were holding forth in the Fuller Building with Betty Parsons next door. Leo Castelli was uptown on 77th Street, along with Paula Johnson, soon to be Paula Cooper, at 68th Street. Ellen Stone, Jill Comley, Martha Jackson, Arne Ekstrom, Bob Elcon, Klaus Curtis, Bygert Galway, and others. By the time Robert arrived, Klaus at Bygert, Dick at the Green Gallery, and Martha Jackson had closed. Pace had moved to East 57th Street, and Janis has moved to West 57th. And the new Paula Cooper Gallery had made the first move downtown to 96 Prince Street, soon to be much better known as Soho. Many galleries were to follow. Castelli, who by then had both opened and closed his Harlem space, Ileana Sonnabend, Charlie Coles, and still later Larry Gagosian, Mary Boone, and others, all opened new galleries or moved south to Soho. In the midst of these galleries all over town, Robert and I were destined to meet, and we did. We then remained close friends for all these years. It was the art that brought us together. Robert showed me many ways to look at new art, such as conceptual art and art for other parts of the world, particularly Asia. One day, long after I had known Robert for a considerable length of time, he told me that the most influential show he had seen as an art student was the Robert Irwin's show at the Rhode Island School of Design. I was surprised, not because of Robert Irwin, but because it was a show that I had organized myself. Irwin had come from California to Providence for 2 weeks to talk with anybody who showed up. This was only Irwin's second museum show. The first had been in Pasadena, the Art Museum, a year before. Robert showed up, and Irwin made an impression on him. Bob was quite a talker. That was in 1969, 56 years ago. Irwin was 41 and Robert was 25. Robert was an artist, critic, and scholar. His literary talents as a writer and teacher, his vast memory made our conversations rich and filled with anecdotes of art history in his assessment of art world themes. Robert was engaging and great company. I wish Robert had not left us, but it is soothing to recall his life and our connection together. I miss him. Robert will always be in my memory and my conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Next, we'll hear from David Eichholz.
Hello. I actually have known Robert for a long time, but I was living out west when we first met, and I didn't physically meet him until I'd moved back to New York, and it was about 5 years ago that we finally started having face-to-face engagements. And so you people have really known Robert, and it's unfortunate that I have not had that ability to have that depth of engagement. But he reached out to me about maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and was interested in representation in our gallery. And he was curious what my thoughts were about his work. And so we started, I had known him mostly through his writing. And so, and that's how I first met him, as I contacted him to write a catalog essay. And so I was intrigued by the work, but I didn't really get to know the diversity of the work or the breadth of it until later. And so when we had the show of the newest paintings and introduced the landscape series, which I think this was the only time they'd ever been presented, and there were other more recent series like the Loja series and things like that, was when I live with artwork every day, seeing it in the gallery and what have you, you really get to know the work, but more importantly, you get to know the artist. And the art does speak to us, at least to me. And so the more I'm around it, I really began to understand it and understand Robert. And what was interesting about Robert, because I'm going to focus mostly just on the artwork, was everything was just diversity is the one thing you think about with Robert. He was a writer, an art historian. He and lecturer. His artistic creations included, nobody's mentioned it here yet, but also photography and film, as well as drawing and painting. He also started out with the gestural work in ink, and then it moved and progressed through conceptualism and performance and other things. And I was sort of struck by that and wondered, that's interesting, because a lot of artists do go through phases and things like that. And what I always find is when people say, oh, wow, this artist has been so scattershot or whatever, and the more you get to know the artist, you realize it's not. It's all related, and it all comes out of their mind, their heart, their soul, and what they're trying to communicate. And that's what I began to realize with Robert, is that there was no distinction with him between what he thought and saw and how he created, and his creativity through his hands and his mouth, through his art history and criticism, as well as making. And he saw all of that, in my opinion, as communication vehicles. And that's when I realized, okay, so performance, it didn't matter that it was for performance versus photography or painting versus, gestural, ink work. It was all about communicating. And then the other thing with Robert, and you all touched on a lot of these things, so I've been sort of rewriting what I was going to say. It's like, okay, well, that's already been covered. That's already been covered. But it proves my point, is that everything with Robert was connected. And it didn't matter if it was performance or if it was photography or if he was lecturing or if he was typing. What he was doing was using his mind and all the influences, the things that he liked, and he didn't want to create boundaries or limits. he didn't want to be limited to any one thing, that I'm a writer, or I'm a painter, or an artist, or I'm a painter versus a filmmaker or whatever. Because again, it was what he wanted to do was use all these different outlets to communicate and to make different statements. And the thing is he was influenced by so many things, and everything. And again, a common thing tonight was dualities and binaries. People have commented on, and I think that's what really informed the artwork and the diversity of the ways he communicated, either through what he created by making it, or writing and speaking it. And it was those things between sort of Eastern and Asian art and Western art, between conceptualism and mysticism versus reality. And so Robert conflated, or tried to create a nexus at all those things, because they were binaries. And to him, because he and I did talk about several of these things because he came and we had very long conversations for several hours there in the gallery. And what he was trying to get at was, he saw them as, they were a binary, but yet there was a point where there was a nexus, there was something. And everything, and also Huang, when he was talking about the argument, was so funny, because Robert he liked argument and he liked challenge, and that's how I think he saw his art and his art making practice, which was doing things in series and really but working through a problem. And how does he find that nexus? Because at that nexus, or where they touch, whether the furthest apart is sort of really where there's the connectivity, and that's what he was after. And so I think that's why he enjoyed so many different ways of expressing himself. And that's what I thought was interesting about his paintings. So what I would say about the paintings are, or about the artwork, the visual art, is that he's not really picture making. He's not making pictures, but what he's doing is making us think. And the paintings look simple and they look geometric. They're small, they're intimate, they're very charming. But when you look at them, they don't read like just a straight hard edge painting or geometric painting. They're not a grid, so they're totally different. And he brings in, and he creates binaries also within them. So there's either matte and shiny, there's high key colors right next to muted tones, there's saturated and desaturated. So he's always pulling these things together, which makes me think that's how he's problem solves. That's what he likes. He likes that challenge. He likes to challenge people and be challenged. So I think the paintings do reflect, and if you get a chance on the gallery's website, you can see there were a number of them, and also he's got a website, and there's books and other things, and you'll see when you look at the paintings, you're kind of like, what's he getting at here? When you look at the series and you kind of look at this one versus that one. And it really makes you think. And then they do have titles like Loggia or Landscape or Focus. But it's not a picture of landscape or loggias. And when you talk to him, they were inspired by that. But in Robert's usual way, he was bringing together different things in his own mind and taking his own complexity and trying to resolve it and put it into something that was a little simpler and easier to look at, but yet had all of that internal tension and made you wonder, why this, why that, why not this, why not that? And I think that's what he was going for, in my opinion, and I wish he and I had more time together. Now, in closing, the other thing is, I never called him Bob. I don't think I knew him well enough. It was always Robert C. Morgan. I dropped the PhD after a while, but he is one of the few people to this day, I can never just call him Robert. It's like Robert C. Morgan. It's like nobody else would know if you didn't say that or if you just said Robert Morgan. So I thought that was sort of interesting, those of you who've commented on that. But he will be very much missed, but the paintings, have longevity just like the writing. So he'll be with us.
Thank you, David. Unfortunately, Carter Ratcliffe was not able to be with us tonight, but Charles is going to come back and read something.
Robert Morgan wrote about art, and so do I. And that made us colleagues. As highly esteemed a colleague as he was for me and so many others in the art world, he was more than that, a real friend. Many times my wife Phyllis Durfner and I had dinner with Robert and Soojung at their house upstate. It was a wonderful place, a former schoolhouse converted into a residence, with an impressive wall full of books that was both a testimony to the wide range of Robert's interests and a substantial portion of his archives. His extensive writings and research materials as shelf rose over shelf all the way to the high ceiling. The effect was very impressive. It may seem a small thing, but the lighting in the main room of Robert's house was extremely subtle, a pattern of direct light and comparative shadow that created a calm and welcoming atmosphere. At the dinner table, an island of brightness. Conversation was lively. Robert was not one of those art world types with a monofocus on art world things. He was interested in film, literature, as well as art, and his insights into whatever might come up for discussion were always striking. He had an adventurous mind, as evidenced by his interest in Korean art. The New York art world tends to be inward-looking, and Robert looked far beyond its borders, finding and introducing Western viewers to important artists they otherwise would not have known. He studied Eastern calligraphy when he was young and immersed him in Taoism, the spiritual tradition known as the Way in English. No doubt these studies helped to make him aware of and receptive to non-Western art. And it points to the originality of his painting, which is the part of his, I don't think that's a word, which is part of, I never met Robert Morgan, the conceptual and performance artist. He was a painter when I knew him, and I was immediately impressed by the quiet power of his work, though quiet may not be quite the right word. His metallic colors are strong, even assertive, without the least hint of pictorial rhetoric or bombast. So the power of his paintings is not quiet so much as imperturbable. They have a serene sort of authority. Labels are hard to avoid, and it's inevitable that we think of Robert as a geometrical abstractionist. After all, he deployed geometric forms on uninflected fields. But the label doesn't really fit, and his affinities with earlier geometric painters, though undeniable, are not all that close. I see profound differences between his canvases and those of Pierre Mondrian, for example, or Casimir Malevich. To get at these differences, we must draw formal distinctions, and these can seem a bit dry. A bit dry. Yet they generate large meanings. Mondrian and others working in his tradition arranged their forms, their bars and block of color, with an eye for the edges and four corners of the canvas. When a composition succeeded, everything fit nicely within the frame. Robert acknowledges the frame, of course, and yet the scale and placement of his forms give them a kind of freedom. Literally contained by the edges of canvas, they nonetheless open pictorial space to the unbounded space beyond the frame. His paintings are metaphors of the infinite. They are also beautiful. The composition of the not exactly black fields. I am interested in the absorption and reflection of light at the same time. I am interested in the absorption and reflection of light at the same instant in time. The plenitude encompassed by opposites, again a vision of the infinite, of all that is. In Robert C. Morgan's Quantum 14, a painting from 2015, forms are parallel to the picture plane. For viewers whose responses are shaped by the still powerful legacy of minimalism, these discs and bars are at one with the physical surface of the canvas. Yet, Morgan's sensibility ranges far beyond precedents set by post-war American art. Afloat in complex orbits around one another, the circular shapes in Quantum 14 bring to mind the geometric abstraction that emerged in Europe in the wake of Cubism. Indeed, the artist has stated his interest in the work of such pictorial geometers as Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and I'm sorry, I'm not an art person. Van Dorsberg. And there are noticeable affinities between their paintings and Morgan's. A crisp clarity of form, for example, and the taut visual structures established by the placement of that form. There are crucial differences as well. Whether they are aligned with the constructivists, de Stigel, or some other band of avant-garde artists, the geometric abstractionists usually limited their palettes to black, white, and the three primary colors. By contrast, Morgan's metallic pigments fill his paintings with a rich array of golds, silvers, and other hues less easily named. Moreover, his dark backgrounds are not, strictly speaking, black, which is sometimes defined as color's absence. In the depths of the Quantum and Lissajous canvases, a certain color is very much present. Mixed from burnt umber and ultramarine, it is not only dark but powerfully absorptive. Drawn to this unique color, vision is captivated, as is light itself. The reflectiveness of Morgan's metallic pigments and the absorptiveness of his backgrounds could be considered opposites, yet a feeling of resolution pervades his paintings and suggests another reading. Seeing reflection and absorption is not as opposites, but as alternatives. We intuit the part they play in giving Morgan's images their aura of all-inclusive unity, for they recall a Taoist teaching which tells us that our senses and emotions are awakened by the harmonious interactions of qualities we see, at first glance as contradictory. Likewise, Morgan understands Eastern and Western traditions as mutually revelatory, despite the familiar claim that every culture is hermetically sealed within its own values and principles. Making no counterclaim, Morgan shows by example that Taoism is compatible with pragmatism. Taoism, called the Way in English, is compatible with pragmatism, a strain of American thought given shape early on by William James and John Dewey. Both the Tao and pragmatism bring us alive to our surroundings, and both guide Morgan as he turns the immediacies of his experience into the aesthetic innovations that mark his oeuvre. Among Morgan's subtler achievements is to have entered a pictorial space beyond the reach of the compositional order characteristic of paintings by Van Doesburg and other modernists. In their work and in Western painting since the time of the Renaissance, small elements are subordinate to larger ones. Each thrust of pictorial energy is answered by a counter-thrust, and the resulting pattern is firmly enclosed by the four edges of the canvas. Morgan exchanges compositional closure for an openness that charges his paintings with energies that reach far beyond the frame, and the unbounded immensities implied by his paintings find a counterpart in the vastness of the imaginative territory his aesthetic traverses. Before he defined himself as an artist, Morgan studied calligraphy, a discipline that requires an uninterrupted focus on a series of gestures. To become a calligrapher is to learn to pay attention. As important as focus is sequence, each mark must be made in the proper order, and temporal imperatives reappeared in Morgan's performance pieces in the 1970s. In 50-50, Learning to Swim, 1974, the artist walked in a circle with a 50-pound bag of sand on his shoulder as the sand slowly flowed out, marking his itinerary on the floor. That done, he repeated the procedure with a second sandbag. Having established a systematic elliptical pattern reminiscent of the path traced by a Lissajous pendulum, he knelt and drew circles around his body at key points in the pattern. Harking back to the repetitions of the Vexo drawings, 1971, the configurations of Morgan's mid-70s performances extend his concern with orderly sequence into three-dimensional space. With their symmetries and asymmetries, the paintings of the late 1960s and early 70s connect not only to Morgan's performance pieces, but also to his most recent works on canvas. Because these newer works echo early ones, it is tempting to suggest that his oeuvre, why does he use this word 7 times? Displays a cyclical sense of time. Surely there's another word. Oh my God, I thought I studied French. Though this suggestion is not entirely wrong, it should not lead us to the conclusion that his oeuvre is structured by rigid patterns of repetition. Temporality in Morgan's art is improvisational, experiential. Focusing exclusively on writing, he made no art during the 1990s. Nonetheless, there is a compelling sweep to his career. Caught up in it, we may well overlook an interesting question. How did calligraphy, which is gestural, lead to geometric hard-edge imagery of his early paintings? His reply is convincingly direct. Geometry can be as expressive as gesture. Tactfully, he leaves unsaid a corollary point. We assign gestural images a monopoly on expressiveness out of unexamined habit. Questioning all of our habits and assumptions, Morgan set aside at the outset of his career the predilection for large canvases that appeared in the 1940s with abstract expressionism. Refusing to confuse literal size with pictorial scale, Morgan notes that small paintings can be as expansive as outsized ones, and his recent work, as he has said, is drifting into outer space. One of Morgan's guiding metaphors is that of the Persian garden, which is strictly contained, walled in, yet able, through nuanced complexity, to evoke the diversity of the universe. With paintings that open onto flexibility, generative spaces, Morgan invokes an infinite that could also be infinitesimally small. In his aesthetic, the big and small do not stand in opposition. They are alternatives to one another, as are the gestural and the geometric, the reflective and the absorptive, the orderly and the contingent. In each of his works, these paired attributes find an equilibrium that is not conceptualized but felt. His art is calmly triumphant, an ongoing celebration of experience in its inexhaustible vitality. Among Morgan's paintings from 2016 is Phobos and Deimos II. Named after the moons of Mars, the work's circular forms allude to the gravitationally intricate situation of a planet with two satellites. The painting's flat, four-cornered planes of the high-keyed color remind us of similar forms in the artist's earlier paintings, as do the angular geometries of Quantum 22 and Lissajous, also from 2016. Mars, of course, is the god of war, and so it made a quasi-anthropomorphic kind of sense to call them fear and dread, Phobos and Deimos. Yet these emotions do not animate this painting. Turning to a mythologized region of our solar system, Morgan has reimagined it. War and its attendant feelings have been turned into a harmony that feels far-reaching but imposes no static resolutions. There is openness in this painting and an atmosphere of possibility, not only on the plane of form but in the realm of imagination. Form and expression have often been understood as contraries in need of reconciliation. However, we find no trace of that need in Morgan's art, which originates in a place where form and expression are alternative names for a single thing, or rather for a wide-ranging but ultimately unified energy. My God. You guys frequently read things this long?
We're now going to see a video from someone else who's not with us here today, which is Aldo Rubino.
Dear Soojung, family and friends. First of all, I would like to thank you, Soojung, for inviting me to be part of this ceremony. I met Robert for the first time over 12 years ago. Immediately, our mutual respect and shared passion for art became the base for a lasting friendship between us, a friendship in which memories and playful joy and intellectual debates. While I live in New York, Robert and I met oftentimes, many of those times with his beloved Soojung, be it for lunch or a museum opening. And his friendship over the years was always honest and supportive. But Robert was much more than an art historian by the books. He was himself an integral part of the most prominent period of contemporary American art, and I had the pleasure of working with him on two projects. One of these projects was his curatorship of geometric obsession, 50 years of geometric abstraction in the US, for which he visited my museum, MACBA, in Buenos Aires. During the 2 years of production of this exhibition, I fondly remember our conversations. His word, a statement to his experience as we walked back together in revival of the 1970s period, and the beautiful memories of Robert that would immerse me in a life fully devoted to art. A life devoted to art and music. What a surprise when, during a talk to students at my museum, Robert started to sing a song to a mesmerized audience, including myself. So was Robert Morgan, a learned art historian, as so much more, a sophisticated aesthete, an accomplished athlete and swimmer, a gourmet, a tireless globetrotter, and a painter himself. I should then like to remember him as a friend, an unforgettable friend. Thanks to all.
It was lovely. Well, now experience a wonderful Korean drum dance by Yoonja Choi with New York Pilgrim Missionary Dance. That was amazing. Korean drum dance by Yoon Choi with New York Pilgrim Missionary Dance. Wow. I felt that in my body, and that was nice. It's an incredible feeling. We're going to have an open sharing now, so if anybody would like to come up and say a few words, you're welcome to do so.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
In the early 70s, Robert was in Boston, had a performance space. He invited me to go up there and perform. And then a little bit later, I think it was the first time he was the director of a gallery on Walker Street in Tribeca, before it was Tribeca. So he and I shared a show there. And then he wrote an article for some of my work. Okay, I have a little thing to read, not too long. I met Robert when he was 24 and in the art program at UC Santa Barbara. This was 1967. He was also doing service as an alternative to military service at Devereux Ranch School for children with special needs. He talked a lot about religion and art, and sometimes botulism. He had studied religion, and he was making art and interested in that. Religion and art because of their uncertainties and the possibility to experience awe. Botulism because it was uncertain and just plain deadly. It came to an ordinary can of food, wasn't visible and didn't stink. It was there just to kill you. You know Robert's sense of humor. He would be laughing. Robert's paintings are awesome for me because visually they put me into an experience of uncertainty leading to awe. They're ambiguous, their elements are on the surface, they're in front of one another and or behind each other and the surface, etc., etc. So you stand there looking at and seeing all this, and it becomes an experience that is unexplainable and wonderfully rewarding deep inside. Robert, when I learned you died, a mysterious and overwhelming feeling came over me and into all of me. It stunned and filled me. It was dreadful and strangely wonderful. Robert, there is something I discovered recently and wanted to talk to you about it. And we talked about a lot of things. Your friends, those who love you, are here, so here goes. Not us, not the Earth, solar system, galaxies, nor our universe, but existence itself is without beginning and without end. It was never created and will never cease. No God created existence. Existence is boundless, everywhere, without limit. Miraculously beyond our understanding, we live briefly in an eternity of existence. So all we have is existence, ourselves, and each other. Robert, we would tell each other we love the other. I am crying as I write this, and will miss this treasure so much. I love you, man. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Anyone else? Reflections, thoughts? Thank you. Any?
And I met Robert in 1977 during the time where East Village has 270 galleries. And we had openings all over. We had music. We had punk rock. We had... I get a little emotional. But Robert came to our openings, supported us with his love. He supported young artists. He supported young musicians, poets. He came to our openings, and he was there. And he was like a mental force for us kids to be reassured that we are doing the right thing. Creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Floor is open. Anybody? If there's no one else, we do have closing remarks by Richard Vine by video.
So there's something we all have done, all of us here, and will not do again. And that is to walk into a room and find Robert Morgan there. My own response was always, okay, at least this will not be dull. Because Robert always had very pointed responses to every situation, every event, every person. Reactions often laced with humor, but always informed by experience. And by that I mean the experience not just of observing, but of doing. He was a phenomenon of productivity. Dozens of books, theoretical topics, and on individual artists. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of articles and reviews. Paintings, poems, films, performances, public lectures, classroom presentations, studio visits, an endless number of countries visited and people met, letters and journals and diaries. Frankly, I never understood how he could do so much without ever seeming to hurry. Indeed, you probably couldn't get him to hurry if you tried. That was just one of the ways in which Robert was cantankerous. I knew Robert for 37 years, and I spent probably 85% of that time disagreeing with him. One of our many differences was that I was very interested in the art world as a system, in how the schools, galleries, auction houses, alternative spaces, museums, publications, online platforms, etc., all interact to produce works and reputations and prices and critical legacies. Robert, although he was, of course, very familiar with all that, tended to dismiss it as mere mechanics. Indeed, in, I think it was 1998, he published a book called The End of the Art World. What preoccupied Robert was instead a mysterious something called art. He fully endorsed Ad Reinhardt's dictum, art is art, and everything else is everything else. The problem was, to my way of thinking, that Robert would never define exactly what art meant to him. It seemed to be something that he just knew and felt inside and could recognize instantly when he saw it somewhere in the world. Sort of like a Greek oracle. It drove me a little crazy, as Robert could do in multiple ways. Yet I nearly always came away from an encounter thinking about what I truly believed and truly felt and why. It was a gift, one he was probably not even aware of giving. In a sense, it's the gift he was. One of the few things that Robert and I always agreed on, however, was that a life dedicated to looking at, thinking about, and in his case, making art, is a life well spent, a good life. And of course, it didn't hurt that the art world is so social. It provided him, as it provides all of us, a constant stream of new experiences, travel, parties, and countless fascinating and exasperating people. One more life statistic. I calculate that in the course of 60 years in the art world, drinking on average just one glass of wine per day, Robert single-handedly consumed 6,240 bottles of wine, mostly red. On one of our last days together, just the two of us in a cafe near Union Square, I came up with something we could finally agree on. Art is a way of loving the world, I said. And we toasted that. Can one have a friend without knowing it? The funny thing is I never thought very much about Robert as a friend, any more than I think about having fingers on my hand. So, intelligent, cranky, opinionated, funny, stubborn, multi-talented, egotistical, utterly devoted to art, sometimes irresponsible, sometimes warmly generous. Yes, yes, and yes. That was Robert. He was, as Hamlet said of his father, he was a man. Take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. Rest in peace, my friend.
Thank you. One final tribute from Peter Lewis, who's going to read a poem by Jack Kerouac.
Sort of. Hi, I'm Peter Lewis, and Robert Morgan was my friend. November, about a year ago, November of 2023, I got a call from Robert. He said, Bob Dylan's coming to town. Buy us a couple of tickets and let's go see him together. And so I did, and we made the pilgrimage out to the King's Theater in Brooklyn, and Bob was in great form that night. It was a splendid evening. And on the way back home, our conversation took many turns, as it always did. We talked about the concert, we talked about James Baldwin, we talked about the Beat Poets, Jack Kerouac, and Robert insisted that the original scroll version was much superior to the originally published version, and I agreed. And so when Soojung asked me to read something, I thought it might be fitting as a sort of benediction to Robert, to revisit the words of Jack Kerouac as he spoke them on the Steve Allen Show in November of 1959, when he said, "A lot of people have asked me, why did I write that book, or any book? All the stories I wrote were true because I believed in what I saw. I was traveling west one time, at the junction of the state line of Colorado, its arid western one, and the state line of poor Utah, and I saw in the clouds, huge and massed above the ethereal golden desert of evenfall, the great image of God, with forefinger pointed straight at me, through halos and rolls and gold folds that were like the existence of a gleaming spear in his right hand, which saith, Come on, boy, go thou across the ground, go moan for man, go moan, go groan alone, go roll your bones alone, go thou and be little beneath my sight, go thou and be my newest seed in the pod, go thou die hence. and of this world report you fair and truly. Anyway, I wrote the book because we're all going to die. And the loneliness of my life, nothing here but my own tragic hands that once were regarded by a world with sweet attention, that now are left to guide and disappear their own way into the common dark of all our death. Sleeping in me raw bed alone is stupid, with just this one pride and consolation. My heart broke in a general despair and opened up inwards to the Lord. I made a supplication in this dream. So in the last page of On the Road, I describe how the hero Dean Moriarty's come to see me all the way from the West Coast, just for a day or two. We'd just been back and forth across the country several times in cars, and now our adventures are over. We're still great friends, but we have to go into later phases of our lives. So there he goes, Dean Moriarty. Ragged in a moth-eaten overcoat he brought especially for the freezing temperatures of the East, walking off alone. The last I saw of him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. Gone. So in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken-down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the West Coast, and all that road going and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. And in Iowa, I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out, and don't you know God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all the rivers, cups the peaks, and folds the final shore in. And nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. I think of Robert Morgan. I think of Dean Moriarty. So long, Robert. Godspeed. Your spirit lives on in our hearts. Amen.
Thank you, everybody. It's been an amazing evening to spend with all of you. Soojung. Refreshments await.